Prova test kontrol. Ses deneme 1-2.
Live from Istanbul, I'm Maria Ramos, also ahead of the programme. We start this hour with breaking news. Russia says it will expel 60 US diplomats and also close the consulate in St. Petersburg. China has scrapped its two-term limit for presidents. Track and field legend Usain Bolt, one of my heroes, has dashed hopes of a return to the field. A better place. The news continues on TRT1 after Roundtable. See you then. Bye for now.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to the Istanbul Development Dialogues, which over the years have become both a crossroads and a platform for the agenda of development and how it is evolving, but also for putting a spotlight on innovations as they emerge from the frontiers of development work across the planet. I'm delighted to be sending you. Ladies and gentlemen,
also closed the consulate in St. Petersburg. China has Welcome to Istanbul, live from Istanbul. I'm Maria Ramos, also ahead of the programme. Start this hour with breaking news. Russia says it will expel 60 US diplomats and also close the consulate in St. Petersburg. China has scrapped its live from Istanbul. I'm Maria Ramos, also ahead of the programme. Hello and welcome to Istanbul, live from Istanbul. I'm Maria Ramos, also ahead of the programme. China has scrapped its two-term limit for presidents. Track and field legend Usain Bolt, one of my heroes, has dashed hopes of a return to the field. US President Donald Trump says a peace deal with North Korea will make the world a better place. Thailand welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Please take your seats as soon as you can. We're just about to start. The delegation is on its way. Thank you. Please take your seats. Yes, you can start. Start the music. And you can dim the lights half.
and welcome to TRT World live from Istanbul. I'm Maria Ramos. Also ahead on the programme. China has scrapped its two-term limit for presidents. Track and field legend Usain Bolt, one of my heroes, has dashed hopes of a return to the field. US President Donald Trump says a peace deal with North Korea will make the world a better place. The news continues on TRT World after Roundtable. See you then. Bye-bye for now. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, hoş geldiniz, bienvenidos to Istanbul Development Dialogues 2018. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here. Now, this is the fourth edition of this forum. It is the fourth time that everybody comes together to get ready for the road to 2030. And the focus this year is very much on partnerships. Why? Because you all need to partner together. Sustainable development is not a one-man job. It is not a solo job. Whether you're a government, an NGO, or a business, you all need to partner up. And the word dialogue is there in the title. And this is very much at the core, at the spirit of what the breakthrough to 2030 is. And it's very much also at the center of why you are all here today. This is a dialogue, a constant dialogue. And for this reason, at any time, please feel free, put your hand up, or if you don't want to do it in person here, if you'd rather do it digitally, this is the hashtag IDD2018. Please tweet in your questions at any time. Now, we have many distinguished guests here today, and thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And I would like especially to say a very big thank you to Cihan Sultanoğlu, who is here, the UN Assistant Secretary General, and also His Excellency Ambassador Murat Yavuz Ateş, Turkey's Deputy Under-Secretary for Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for coming. But first, we have another distinguished guest who couldn't be here today, but has sent this welcome video. And that's Achim Steiner, the administrator of the UNDP. Take a listen.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome to the Istanbul Development Dialogues, which over the years have become both a crossroads and a platform for the agenda of development and how it is evolving, but also for putting a spotlight on innovations as they emerge from the frontiers of development work across the planet. I'm delighted to be sending you this brief message at the opening of these development dialogues because I believe that the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda truly do mark a milestone in our global development discourse. Not only have they given us a conceptual framework and a common language through which to look at development, they are universal. They are focused around issues of inequality and equity, but also sustainability as integral to the future of our economies. As representatives of governments, of civil society, of the private sector, of academia and the scientific community, you all appreciate how critical partnerships will be in trying to address this agenda. What has been striking over the past year and a half is how the SDGs have resonated in so many different countries, with so many different actors, in so many different settings. Whether it is with those who are concerned about the challenge of inequality, which continues to divide our societies and often cause strife and conflict, the challenge of sustainability in addressing climate change, the decarbonization of our economies, while at the same time creating livelihoods and jobs for future generations. And all of this while ensuring that our economies can continue to develop and deliver food security, climate security, health, educational services. The 2030 Agenda, the SDGs, truly are a driver for innovation, and it is through this lens that we have also in the United Nations Development Programme designed our new strategic plan. It is to be a platform. It is to be a platform for integrating different competencies, capacities, institutional opportunities, and to work together in support of countries that are putting in place the conditions for achieving a 2030 Agenda and making the Sustainable Development Goals the best insurance against both unmanageable ecological risks, unacceptable social risks, and ultimately, when these two risks combine, also risks to our economic future. So, once again, welcome to the Istanbul Development Dialogues. I wish you very productive discussions, and we in UNDP look forward to drawing from the wisdom, the experience, and the expertise that you have assembled here. Thank you. Teşekkür ederim.
And now I'd like to give the floor to Cihan Sultanoğlu, the UN Assistant Secretary General, for the opening remarks to the Istanbul Development Dialogues 2018. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Excellency Ambassador Murat Yavuz Ateş, Deputy Undersecretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Turkey, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends and colleagues. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the 4th edition of the Istanbul Development Dialogues. As you all know, this year the dialogues are dedicated to partnerships for the Sustainable Development Goals, the road to 2030. Their importance is apparent in the title. The Global Agenda 2030 and its accompanying Sustainable Development Goals are the world's development agenda. They represent a commitment by the world's governments and the global development community to ensuring peace and prosperity, that we live within our planetary boundaries and that we leave no one behind in doing so. Of course, many meetings and fora are devoted to these issues, and you have attended many of them, I'm sure. However, many of these occur within intergovernmental frameworks like the ECOSOC High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development that takes place in New York, or the Regional Forum on Sustainable Development that takes place in Geneva, and organized by the UN Economic Commission for Europe. Other meetings are organized by international financial institutions who focus on how to move from billions of dollars of official development assistance to the trillions of dollars needed to finance the 2030 agenda. Other meetings are convened by private companies who are ensuring that their business models are ecologically and socially sustainable, as well as commercially profitable. And still other meetings are held by academic and civil society institutions that ask hard questions about whether, in fact, we are moving towards sustainable development and not away from it. This year's Istanbul Development Dialogues connect these different sustainable strands and narratives together. Under a broad partnership heading, we are bringing the government practitioners who are making the nuts and bolts of Agenda 2030 work together with representatives of financial institutions who are reorienting development finance in support of their efforts. We are joined in this by representatives of private companies who are designing and commercializing the technologies needed for sustainable production and consumption. Last but not least, leading representatives of civil society and academic institutions are also present. These partners are often placed to ask hard but necessary questions about how the sacrifices and trade-offs required for sustainable development are being managed. They are also on the cutting edge of efforts to apply innovative, forward-looking platform approaches to development within the UN system and other development agencies, as well as in governments and the private sector. At the United Nations Development Programme, we believe that it's only through partnerships and common efforts among these different stakeholders that we can make real progress towards sustainable development on the road to 2030. In this lies the importance of this year's Istanbul Development Dialogues. This is also why we are so pleased that we have such a strong participation. We look forward to working with you in our efforts to go beyond business as usual, to development, to ask hard questions about whether we are fit for purpose for implementing Agenda 2030, and to identify new, innovative solutions to the challenges that we face collectively. As you know, the 2030 Agenda is often described in terms of the 5 Ps, of which partnerships is only one. In addition to dedicated sessions on the role of partnerships between all the stakeholders, our program also features sessions devoted to the other 4 Ps: peace, people, planet, and prosperity. We hope this program will accommodate the breadth of perspectives needed for the multi-sectoral partnerships that must underpin truly integrated development approaches. Moreover, as in the past years, the IDD also features a partnerships forum, open mic session, in which representatives of institutions that cannot be accommodated in other parts of the program may take the floor and share their perspectives on these issues. As we move in the next 2 days, I would like to encourage all of us to keep 3 sets of questions in mind. First, how do we get prices right for sustainable development? Economics 101 teaches us that activities with negative externalities should be taxed, while those with positive externalities should be subsidized. But in the region with some of the world's lowest employment rates, taxes on labor a third or more of average wages. This tax wedge pushes people out of the labor force, pushes jobs into the informal sector. Such policies are difficult to reconcile with SDGs 8 and 10, which emphasize the importance of inclusive growth, decent jobs, and first and foremost, reducing inequalities. Meanwhile, state budgets allocate billions of dollars to fossil fuel subsidies that increase carbon footprints and slow economic diversification. These subsidies are at odds with the national commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that have not been undertaken under the Paris Climate Change Accord, as well as with SDG 13 on climate action. What can be done to make sustainable production and consumption realities and not just slogans? Second question, how can we get governance for sustainable development right? Agenda 2030 and the SDGs are based on the premise that rights-based approaches are preconditions for sustainable development. But the liberal global order on which development cooperation is based is increasingly challenged by populist preferences for group identity over individual rights. Meanwhile, governance for sustainable development debates often narrowly focus on technocratic questions of policy coordination and coherence. How can we ensure that governance for sustainable development leaves no one behind, as well as providing technical support for national SDG implementation? And the third question, how do we get innovation right? Technology and innovation have obviously made and continue to make critical contributions to socioeconomic development and good governance. This is apparent in the ways in which governments are embracing digitalization agendas and in which IT sectors are producing growing numbers of decent jobs across the region. In Kyrgyzstan, the government's Tazakum digitalization program is seeking to accelerate progress towards sustainable development. Belarus's ICT sector now generates twice as much foreign exchange as do pipeline shipments of energy to Europe. But growing numbers of people view technology and innovation as making traditional forms of employment and social protection obsolete, while potentially creating new threats to privacy and human rights. Meanwhile, businesses and governments are increasingly concerned about preventing hacking, fake news, and cyber warfare? How can global sustainable development processes help ensure that innovation serves people rather than the other way around? These are difficult and sometimes even uncomfortable questions. But if we are serious about sustainable development, they must be asked and answers must be found. At UNDP, we are committed to helping all our partners, all stakeholders, to find answers to these questions. Fortunately, there are also many good examples on which to draw within the region and beyond. The government of Ukraine since 2014 has dramatically decreased fossil fuel subsidies as part of its efforts to promote energy security, ecological sustainability, and good governance. It has also significantly cut taxes on labor and is now benefiting from growing employment rates and wages. Turkey is not only accommodating over 3 million refugees from Syria, it is also granting them access to Turkish labor markets. Many other such examples can be shared, and no doubt will be shared during the next 2 days. Let me stress that here in UNDP, we are committed to supporting all these efforts. We are also working closely with other UN agencies, as well as the World Bank and other international financial institutions, in support of efforts to align national development programming with the SDGs via the so-called MAPS platform. By assisting with SDG mainstreaming, acceleration, and policy support, MAPS helps governments put in place the frameworks needed, not only to report against the Sustainable Development Goals, but also to find triple-win solutions to national, economic, social, and environmental challenges. The technical meeting that we held yesterday, and I know some of you participated in it, on the initial lessons learned from the MAPS missions that have been undertaken in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, was an important step on the road to 2030. These lessons can be applied to the MAPS missions scheduled to be undertaken this year in Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Serbia, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. It is then very much our hope that this year's Istanbul Development Dialogues will not only showcase these efforts, but will also help them to become more significant, more effective, more collectively owned. After all, this is a universal agenda, and this is a cohesive agenda. It's only by working together with all our partners within the UN system, among governments, the international development community, the private sector, and civil society, as well as the academia, that we can hope to move firmly and resolutely on the road to 2030 so that we won't leave anyone behind. Thank you very much, and I wish you much success. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce His Excellency Ambassador Murat Yavuz Ateş, Turkey's Deputy Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, for his opening remarks to the conference. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Assistant Secretary General Cihan Sultanoğlu, Deputy Ministers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to warmly welcome you all on behalf of my government to the 4th International Development Dialogue and to Istanbul. Turkey is honored to be the host of this important development policy forum, and I want to take this opportunity to thank the UNDP Regional Hub for Europe and CIS for their efforts to organize an inspiring event each year. Istanbul Development Dialogue as a platform for forward-looking knowledge exchange, has become a global flagship event in development cooperation circles and beyond, which provides a vibrant intellectual and professional environment, reinforcing regional hubs' role as a development thought leader. The presence of more than 400 participants is a testimony to the significant contribution this gathering makes to complement and support intergovernmental processes to implement sustainable development goals. It is not a coincidence that Istanbul hosts events of this nature. Turkey aims to turn Istanbul into a global hub for UN agencies and other international organizations, particularly those that are specialized in different aspects of development cooperation. UNDP Regional Hub has alone hosted around 40 major events annually, firmly positioning Istanbul as a venue of choice for UNDP and the UN family. Our ambition is to become a hub of new initiatives, new ideas, and new solutions. We are hoping to partner with the countries of the South, as well as those of the North, to make this vision come true in the near future. Distinguished participants, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is an ambitious framework that urges all stakeholders to take robust action for the noble goal of leaving no one behind. Turkey's national development model is human-centered and, like SDGs, focuses on economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. Turkey has been one of the 22 countries that presented voluntary national review during the first high-level political forum in 2016. In 2017, the Turkish government conducted a comprehensive stock-taking project in consultation with the relevant stakeholders in order to identify the current state of affairs with regard to the implementation of the SDGs in Turkey. This analysis provided a unique opportunity to integrate and mainstream SDGs for our main national policy documents. Turkey believes that the SDGs cannot be achieved without strengthened global partnership for mobilizing the means of implementation. Official development assistance has a critical role in achieving SDGs, especially in least developed countries. Preliminary data for 2017 suggests that Turkey's ODA for this year has reached $8.2 billion, doubling since 2015. Thus, Turkey exceeded 0.7% ODA per GNI target determined by the United Nations since 2016. We value our partnership with the UNDP, which assists Turkey in strengthening its role and capacity as an emerging donor. We are committed to continuing this cooperation. Our partnership with UNDP strengthens the multilateral dimension of our development cooperation. Our objective is to shift the focus of our partnership from domestic projects to cooperation in third countries, that is, triangular cooperation with special emphasis on LDCs and LICs. Efforts to achieve SDGs will require a massive amount of financial resources. It is essential to diversify financial instruments and direct them towards sustainable development priorities. Therefore, Turkey, together with UNDP, pioneered to emphasize the role of private sector to achieve SDGs through the establishment of Istanbul International Center for Private Sector in Development back in 2013. Istanbul Center today serves the whole UNDP system with tools, resources, and global platforms on inclusive business, impact investment, and Islamic finance, skills development, and resilience, just like the Istanbul Regional Hub. Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting coincides with a time when comprehensive reform process is underway to further strengthen UN development system. We would be happy to hear how you see the way forward. The achievement of sustainable, balanced, and strong global economic growth is crucial for global stability and security. Rising inequalities in the world necessitates the international community to take comprehensive and robust action towards inclusive growth. The 2030 Agenda motto, "Leaving no one behind," is only possible by adopting a truly inclusive approach. Inclusiveness means listening to each and every stakeholder. Strong ownership is a key feature for effective, timely implementation. Addressing global challenges under the framework of 2030 Agenda requires adequate means of implementation. The main elements are finance, capacity building, technology transfer, and market access for the least developed and low-income countries. Furthermore, current humanitarian crises around the world are closely related to the development challenges of the countries. Humanitarian assistance should go hand in hand with development assistance, thereby building infrastructural human capacity and increasing resilience to shocks. The share of Turkey's ODA allocated to least developing countries exceeded $1.5 billion in the past 5 years. Turkey is strengthening its status as a reliable development partner for LDCs. Furthermore, as part of its policy to support the least developing countries, the Technology Bank, a new UN entity dedicated to the LDCs, was operationalized on 22nd September with the signing of the host country agreement between the government of Turkey and the United Nations in New York. It marks an important milestone in global efforts to strengthen the science, technology, and innovation capacity in the world's 47 least developed countries. The new bank will contribute to the efforts to achieve Sustainable Development Goal Target 17.8 and respond to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development's principle of leaving no one behind. The Technology Bank will be located in Gebze, Turkey. This bank is expected to improve the utilization of scientific and technological solutions in the world's poorest countries and promote the integration of least developed countries into the global knowledge-based economy. An SDG incubator to be located within the Technology Bank in Gebze will train and support startups and new enterprises which are capable of innovating products and services to address the needs of vulnerable communities, particularly women, children, and refugees. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has set a new scene for governmental and non-governmental actors. Business as usual is not an option anymore. In order to achieve the global goals, multi-stakeholder partnerships are needed in all areas and at all levels. In particular, we need triangular partnership between governments, private sector, and civil society to generate urgent transformative changes and innovate business models to support inclusive growth. I wish you all a productive meeting. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a very quick announcement. We're going to take a few minutes to arrange the stage and we'll be back with you in just a few minutes, okay?
see numbers in action. I wanna see numbers in action. I wanna see numbers in action. I wanna see. I wanna see numbers in action. 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 I wanna see.
Looks ready to me.
Technology has changed my life.
Ladies and gentlemen,
first time I was using internet, it was like my mother says something.
I have the pleasure of introducing the first panel of the day. Now, with this, we really want to set the stage for the conference and for everything for the next 2 days. Sustainable development in Europe and Central Asia, where do we stand? That's the title. And this is very much the big picture, especially in terms of economic drivers, technology and politics, as mentioned in Cihan Sultanoğlu's speech. And before I introduce the panelists, just a quick comment on timekeeping. It's very important to keep on time. And I will be wrapping up 5 minutes before the end, but do think of your questions as well. Now, I would like to give the floor to our panel moderator, Ms. Irena Voyachkova Soyorano, the UNDP resident representative for Turkey. And I'd also like to welcome the panelists' first session. First of all, we have Professor Sergei Guriev, Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Thank you.
And secondly, we have Dr. Igor Luksic, Regional Manager, Southeast Europe, PwC, and former Prime Minister of Montenegro. Pleasure to see you.
Welcome everybody, and welcome to this first panel. And it is a scene-setting panel because it is referring directly to the opening speeches that we had. The development dialogue in Istanbul is setting the scene now for several years, and I think that the eminent panel that we have today will help us to set the scene for this year. And this year we are looking specifically at 3 questions, as was mentioned by Assistant Secretary General Ms. Sultanoğlu. It is about getting the prices right, it is about getting governance right, and it is about getting innovation right. All of these issues are giving us major challenges today, in a positive and in a negative way. And we have to focus on actually turning our questions into the positive one and to see how is it that we can minimize the negative effects. It is the economic situation that is giving us major challenges. And because of these challenges, many other social issues are getting out of joint. And I think we have seen many of it in the last months, not only in this region, but globally. So I would like to give the panelists a chance to give us their vision on these three questions, and maybe not only their vision, but also what are their recommendations. What is it that all of us, international organizations, government, private sector, civil society, what is it that we have to do differently this time around so that we adjust to the new times? So I will give the word to Mr. Guriev from EBRD, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. Indeed, this is a very important moment in our history where we've committed to Agenda 2030 and think about the massive investment and development that we need to undertake. And indeed, as both speakers mentioned in their introductory remarks, these challenges are huge. And I think it is important to understand that we need to do it differently now, in the sense that governments and international organizations don't really have enough resources to address those goals alone. And that means that we need to involve private sector. We need to create incentives for the private companies to invest in driving the development agenda. And we, as a BRD, a private sector bank, have done quite a bit in this region, thinking how to crowd in private investment, how to create incentives, how to provide governments with advice on reforms, and indeed learn from some countries and move the lessons learned to other countries to promote development, impactful investment. So I fully agree with this triangle of prices, governance, and technology moving ahead to provide incentives for the private sector. So let me just indicate several things on prices, on governance, and innovation. On prices, of course, if we want sustainable development to take place, we need to get prices of fossil fuels right. In many of our countries, we still have fossil fuel subsidies. That, of course, creates wrong incentives for the private sector. We do research looking at firms, and we see that if you have fossil fuel subsidies, the best firms actually do not invest in energy efficient technology because it makes no sense to. When you remove fossil fuel subsidies, you see that private sector has the right incentives. It moves into investing in energy efficient and environmentally sustainable technology. So this is one of the things which needs to be corrected. Another price which is out there is the price of skills. So in many of our countries, educational systems are outdated. And then the question is, when students at all ages come into education systems, when they decide which career to pursue, unfortunately, many of them don't get market signals on which skills are the right ones and going to be the right ones in the future. And this is a big, big issue, how to partner with the private sector to make sure that workers, and especially young workers, workers that will be working in the decades to come in the economies in the region, would know which skills to invest in. And this is where, again, governments have to partner with the private sector, with employers associations, with employers individually to figure out who is going to be more successful in the decades to come in the new global economy. Finally, another price which has to be corrected is the price of moving from informal to formal sector. In many of our countries, price of informal labor and price of formal labor are incorrect. And so many entrepreneurs remain in the informal sector. And they don't grow, because growing means exiting informal sector. So governments need to make sure that taxes and regulation and anti-corruption policies are structured in the way that it makes sense to create formal jobs, which of course are more productive and more socially sustainable, since they bring pensions, they bring social benefits, they bring inclusion that we talked about in the opening session. So this is also key, to make sure that taxes don't discourage entrepreneurs from moving into the formal sector. Now, on governance. So, of course, governance is the key issue. And in this region in particular, we saw that growth models which lead into non-meritocratic and unfair distribution of benefits of growth are not politically sustainable. In many of our countries, we saw that transition to market economy has created growth, has created convergence with more developed countries, but the benefits of this convergence have not been distributed widely and fairly. And in those countries, we saw politicians who rejected the reforms, came to power, and in some cases even removed political checks and balances, thus undermining further development. So it is clear that the growth models, economic models, have to be fair and inclusive, which means governments and countries and societies should create a social contracts where people do pay taxes. Tax evasion is not tolerated, and corruption is not tolerated. And I think we have a lot of motion in this direction, but more has to be done. And this is where technology may actually help. We talked about the successes in this region. There is a big champion in electronic government, Estonia. There is major progress in a country which used to be very corrupt. It is still not a champion of transparency and good governance, but there is a big progress that has been made in Ukraine, for example, on electronic procurement. And we see how new technology can actually create transparency and accountability of government. Much more has to be done, but technology creates opportunity. Technology also creates opportunity for inclusion. Many people who cannot travel to their jobs, women for whom sometimes it is unsafe to travel to their jobs in some of our countries, or culturally less acceptable to travel to their jobs, it is easier to work from home, and it is easier to work during flexible hours. And I'm not even talking about people with disabilities for whom technology is actually opening up opportunities, economic opportunities in particular. Now, creating the right incentives for innovation is not easy. Many of our countries in this region have completed transition from low income to middle income. This is one growth model where jobs are created through investment in labor-intensive industries, enjoying the comparative advantage of low wages. Now, when you're at the middle income stage of development, wages are no longer low, so you need to invest in high value-added manufacturing, in high value-added services, knowledge-based economy, and that is, of course, much harder, because that needs another set of institutions, needs the development of non-bank financial instruments, equity markets, capital markets, better corporate governance. It also needs investment in information communication technology infrastructure. It also needs investment in research and development. It also needs creation of clusters of knowledge-based economies, so people who have left our countries for more developed countries can come back and prosper in innovative businesses. And that, of course, is a new challenge, but this is the challenge that has to be tackled, and many of our countries have tackled those challenges, and I'm happy to talk about that if you have questions. Overall, I think we should be optimistic. In what way? In the way that many of our countries have actually been quite successful in transition to innovative, well-governed, and competitive economies. Not everybody, and unfortunately, majority of our countries have yet to make this transition. But I think overall solutions exist, and I'm looking forward to this conference discussing success stories, not just the challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for setting the scene, and now I will give the word to Mr. Lokšić, please.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, good morning to you all, and I'm really pleased to be able to be here, and I'd like to thank you for a very kind invitation. It's my first time to attend Istanbul Development Dialogue, and it really is a fascinating event, which brings different stakeholders together to discuss how we should work together to bring about a sustainable development agenda. Not only in terms of defining it, it's been already defined, but in terms of implementing, in terms of attaining the goals. And while waiting for our panel to start, I watched the ad film which talked about SDGs, which talked about some targets. And it was interesting that showing some targets, at the end of the film it said, basically suggesting it's an important and difficult target to meet, but said we have only 14 years left. Actually, we have only 12 years left. Obviously, it was made 2 years ago. But this is to point that time passes quickly. And we should also ask ourselves, are we really happy with the progress we've made? Because as foreign minister back then, I attended the SDG General Assembly meeting in New York 2015. There was a lot of enthusiasm, rightly so, because having sustainable development goals and having Agenda 2030, it really is already a global and great achievement of the mankind, because it is for the first time that we have a comprehensive global agenda, and we should not forget about that. But are we happy with the progress we've made since 2015 in terms of really making sure that we are going to be happy with when 2030 comes and when we go through the outcome and results? So the development dialogue obviously helps. An SDG agenda at the same time makes our life easier, but I think it also makes our life a bit more difficult. Back then, when we first had Millennium Development Goals, some people argued it was a bit top-down. It came as an effort to start a new millennium with some global agenda. And we had different results. Even my country, Montenegro, had mixed results. Although, when you look at those goals, my first thinking would be, okay, I think Montenegro should and must meet all those goals. But when I now take a look at what we achieved a lot, but still we didn't manage to meet all those Millennium Development Goals. And then in 2015, we get the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is even more comprehensive. This time around, it comes bottom up. All the countries took part. All the countries projected some of the challenges from their regions, and rightly so. So in a way, it makes our life now easier because we agree about global agenda, and it should navigate our efforts to define instruments, to identify tools, to bring about good policies, and later on implement them. But at the same time, I think it also makes our life difficult, because I think both of our responsibility and accountability should grow, and we should understand that in 2030 it would be really a tragedy to say that we've spent 15 years, we've done something, but we are still far from happy, far from where we should be. At the same time, I think one should also be aware that 15 years is probably not enough. But I think we need to respond to all these questions now properly. Because if we get prices right, if we get governance right, and if we get innovation right, then I think we will be setting the stage for the next 10 or 12 years to do right things. And then in 2030 say, okay, this is where we should concentrate our efforts to make sure that 2050 Sustainable Development Goals are really there, and that we're happy with what humankind has been able to achieve. Going back to our region and referring to some of the aspects of getting prices right, and I like the point made Ms. Sultanoglu in her speech about the need to get prices right in terms, for example, of the tax wedge, which is pretty stimulating. And again, using the example of my country, but country in the region, I come from Western Balkans. When you compare our tax wedge with the OECD average, then you find out that we are somewhere in the average. But when you compare, for example, Montenegro as a small country with where some other small countries are, which are members of the OECD, then you realize that Montenegrin tax wedge is much higher than in those countries. For example, Malta or Cyprus or Luxembourg or some other small countries. And that in the OECD basket, you have different countries where some which are highly developed see a lot of taxed labor, and some which are very competitive, closer to what probably our systems are, which are a lot more stimulating. So there's an obvious question which comes out of this analysis, short analysis. What do we do to correct these prices? Is it really easy for policymakers to come one day and say, oh, this is really a big problem, this is stimulating, let's just cut that by half? Is it really possible? I don't think it's really possible. I was in those shoes, and I remember 14 years ago when I first became finance minister, the tax wedge I inherited was really huge. For €1 of net salary, companies had to pay more than €1 for different taxes, social contributions. It was huge. So we started gradually cutting it, and we came to a point when it was per €1 net salary, it was about 60 euro cents of different taxes and social contributions. But at the same time, bear in mind that you need to continue with producing public services or quality public services because people expect that from you. But then crisis hit, and first thing you usually do, especially incentivized, let's put it that way, by some international financing organizations, you need to take a different view and probably tax more, because you're expected to write your deficits, write your budget balance and so on, to make sure that your fiscal books are sustainable, to make sure that you are able to accumulate more debt, to go to the market, to show that a country is coming out of the hole or the crisis and so on and so on. So now 2018, we're there with the real issue. How to make it more competitive, how to respond to this need. And it's obviously not only labor taxation, it's other aspects of getting prices right. And we can come back to this issue because it is obviously a very important one. Getting governance right. One may think that Sustainable Development Agenda, again, brings us all together, setting goals and setting targets, and it should be pretty straightforward. But I think it only hides a big debate and a big war, ideological war that still is waged underneath, because you can apply different approaches. I'm pretty sure that the same agenda, same targets, if offered to liberal economists, they'll tell you pretty much that market economy is the only way forward, the competition will solve it, that no state intervention, and so on and so on. You can turn to other people who favor more state-led interventions, and they will splash you with arguments that Sustainable Development Agenda cannot really be attained without strong state intervention, without some subsidies, and so on and so on. So despite the fact that it may look pretty straightforward, there is still a lot of room for fierce battle between different camps. So this morning, preparing for this panel, actually, Rena started a discussion about are we able to produce new economic concepts? And probably academics will agree, but are we able to transfer those concepts into what governments do? It's also quite questionable, because sometimes there is, or even always, there is a problem of distribution. Private companies, private markets, individuals are usually supposed to produce goods, services, basically generate wealth. But governments are expected to distribute the income properly. But all the governments are under strong influence of interest groups, vested interest groups. So is it really so simple? Is it straightforward? Is it easy to develop new economic concept? And there's a lot of discussion I'm sure to take place in time to come. And unfortunately, very briefly on getting innovation right. What we see nowadays in the countries of the Western Balkans, for example, is probably what we saw also in other transitional countries. But historically, we've seen that in Western Balkan countries for decades. Going back 100 years ago, people tend to emigrate from the countries from Western Balkans because of poverty, because of lack of development, going to immigration welcoming countries like United States, Canada, Australia, South America back then. In the 20s, it was really, for Montenegrin, average Montenegrin, it was pretty much the same thing to either go to Buenos Aires or New York. So many people left, and there's a big, actually, community in Argentina. So, but what I'm trying to say is that historically, we are used to people leaving, trying to find a better life somewhere else. So how do we handle that? Does Sustainable Development Agenda bring us hope that we should stop that? And are we getting innovation policy right? Because if we are able to capture the technological progress, then probably in the right way, then probably we'll be able to help young people identify opportunities, grab their opportunities, and rather stay in our region than move along. Because the last thing we want to see is skillful people continuing to leave and our region becoming a sort of remittances dependent region. And we already see some underdeveloped regions becoming something like that. So Sustainable Development Agenda should also help us avoid that big risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank both of you for bringing two different sides of the coin for these three questions. Because one is, what is it that, in theory and from the market perspective we see? And the other reality is, what is it that actually governments can do? And then we have, and thank you for referring to the SDGs, then we have the long-term perspective of SDGs, which of course goes now, we say 12 years, but it is beyond any legislative period of any government. So these are challenges that societies have and governments have to face, because they have to do changes which might have an impact beyond their own legislative periods. So with this, I would like to open the forum and to remind everybody that we are in a region that has actually created the economic models for the world, and the most extreme and most revolutionary models. So I think the experience is in our region, the energy is in our region, and by now also the region is the home of most of the middle-income countries that are actually facing the challenges that we have. That means doing the leap from a homegrown economy into a knowledge-based economy, which requires interconnectivity and which requires cooperation between the job market and the private sector and the government to get the future right for everybody in society. So I would like to open the floor, and I'm looking forward for receiving challenging questions.
Can I get volume? Hi, if we don't have a question yet, I'm going to bring one from Twitter that we have. And the question is, how do we bring in the private sector in a massive way to get the job done on the SDGs? I'll see who wants to tackle that one first.
Yes, thank you very much. This is the most important question for us, for our bank, which works with the private sector. And especially in this country, in Turkey, 97% of our business is with the private sector. And basically, it is actually my job in the bank to define the metrics that we introduce into our project. So whenever we select projects, each project that we do has to generate return. This is what we call sound banking. It has to be additional, complementary to the private sector. We are very careful not to crowd out private sector, but to crowd it in. And the third characteristic of the project is transition impact. So we need to make sure that every project delivers in terms of getting the country closer to SDGs, basically. And we define sustainable market economy as an economy which is competitive, well-governed, inclusive, resilient, green, and integrated. And basically, the story is companies come to us and they say, well, you're charging market rates, and why would we do something which is otherwise is not required by other investors, by private banks, by other donors, by other investors. And we say, in the long run, being environmentally sustainable is good business. If you invest in assets that in the long run will be stranded assets, it's actually bad business. And investors already today realize that. So if we as EBRD researchers will look at prices of assets listed around the world, and there is this data set called FTSE Russell Low Carbon Economy Index, which looks at share of green revenues in each company's business. And we show that actually already today there is no punishment for investors investing in greener business. Why? Because when you invest, when you buy equity in companies, you think about long-term performance of those assets. And already today there is actually a premium in terms of price-earnings ratio for greener companies. Why? Because investing in stranded assets is not good business. Now, we talk to companies and we say creating opportunities for women is actually good business. Why? Because women will be a much more important part of the labor force, whatever you do, in years to come. Maybe in the couple of years, that's not going to happen in some countries in the region. But in 10 or 20 years, you have to rely on women creating value for your company. And so this is also good business. Just think long term. All companies and all governments, all international organizations are moving in this direction. And since we now have anchored those expectations for Agenda 2030, saying that by 2030 we are going to move in that direction, hopefully we will deliver on 2030 agenda, even though that's just 12 years to come, but definitely the momentum is there. So if you believe in moving in that direction, that means that thinking about inclusion, thinking about sustainability is actually good business. And raising awareness, but also providing funds which are impact investing funds or funds coming from organizations like EBRD or IFC is something that private sector, especially long-term oriented private investors, already realize. Thank you.
I'd like to subscribe to what Professor Guriev just said. I think it is really very important to understand, and I really like the question. I think it's really most crucial question, how to respond to the needs. Because when you look at and I think it has also been mentioned in the opening remarks, I think when you look at official development assistance on a yearly basis, it's roughly about $150 billion. Whereas in order to make sure that SDGs will be met at some point, yearly investment in a way should be, let's say, 1.5 trillion. So ODA is only 10% of the needs, of the money needed. So when you're confronted with those figures, probably your immediate reaction would be, wow, but that's impossible. How can we come from 150 billion to 1.5 trillion? But I really believe the money is not the problem here. I think the point is how to organize, how to make sure that everybody points to the right direction. Paradoxically, I think top 15 countries that spend on defense, they spend 1.5 trillion, I think, on defense. And don't forget that development and distributed development around the globe reduces the needs for investing in security and defense. But let's be more realist and let's put this aside. I believe that this can be reached via more coordinated efforts. At the same time, we must not forget that, like it or not, what companies are motivated or stimulated by is the profit they make. Because if there's no profit, there's no economic activity. But we can engage in a discussion of different kinds of profits, and we can engage in discussion how to distribute the profit made. And this is, I think, one of the avenues to take. Expanding global partnerships and reaching out to the private sector. I'm sure there are a lot of entities who are incredibly interested in investing in their social responsibility role and other mechanisms to make sure that we all point to the right direction. And I think it is exactly the role of UNDP, of international other international organizations to bring them on, to bring them all on board. And it is really, as far as I read it, the spirit of Goal 17 to reach out, to make sure that we get together and we are aware of our responsibility. So I really appreciate this question. I think this is an essential one, because only us, I mean, discussing government policies and so on, will not be there, because government policies are forged by entrepreneurial politicians, visionary politicians, that's fine, and leaders, but it is also set by circumstances. It has to be a two-way street. We need to be able to understand what comes next and be proactive. But the only way to be proactive is if all the stakeholders are on board.
Thank you very much. So it is up to the international community to create the right circumstances. And that's our SDGs. Yes, we have questions. Yes, please. Do we have a mic? Just a minute.
Thank you very much.
If you can introduce yourself, please.
My name is Pratibha Mehta. I'm UNRC in Tajikistan. First of all, thank you very much to the panelists for raising some excellent points. And my question is the flip side of the incentives. I think we've reached a point where I believe there is no more debate that private sector involvement is necessary to achieve SDGs, so much so that even some socialist countries are embracing this, approach. But the question is of accountability as well. And I believe that while we are looking at ways to provide incentives to private sector, we also have to pay attention to how to hold them accountable. And the case in point are two recent incidents. One is the use of big data by Facebook for political purposes. Of course, there's still investigation going on, but I think it raises fundamental issues on accountability. The second is a recent study done by International Committee on Financing Education by International Taxation Network, which found that every year about $600 to $650 billion are evaded, tax evasion of $600 to $650 billion by multinational corporations around the world. Now, these issues also have to be looked into, and so EBRD, who has a very important role in also setting policies and ensuring accountability mechanisms, says what more is needed, and globally, but also what can be the role of UNDP in ensuring accountability of private sector involvement in the interest of people and in the interest of sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We might take the second question and then we pull it. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Yernar Zerkesov, Astana Civil Service Hub Advisory Board, Kazakhstan. Thank you for the interesting insights. My question is about the synergy between the governments, the private sector organizations, like especially consulting firms, and the civil society organizations. On the one hand, the consulting firms have accumulated a lot of expertise, especially in the field of governance, but they are inherently profit-driven. On the other hand, especially in our region, there are not always the real political will to drive long-term sustainable development, given the fact that the politicians are more inherently focused on quick wins. The sustainable long-term agendas sometimes are overlooked. So my question is, how has the UNDP been effective in generating the political will of the governments to really capture this synergy between the private sector firms and the governments, especially given the fact that the capacities of civil servants at the local levels, not central government, but local government levels, also is a major concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe we go to the first question, please.
Yeah, actually I try to offer a quick comment on both questions, which I find, both questions are really very interesting ones. Referring to multinational companies evading $650 billion, well, I haven't read the report, but I would assume it's more about making sure they pay less by using the advantage of different tax schemes rather than evading. So it probably opens up the question of the need to synchronize tax regimes around the globe to make sure that they are taxed properly. But this also shows a great potential of huge money that can be used for right purposes. But also this reminds me on the fact that there's a lot of talk about how to capture economic potential of countries, because there is true evasion and there is true grey economy in many countries. There's a lot of grey economy which is not taxed in Western Balkans, in Central Eastern Europe, I suppose in other parts of the world. And I actually liked one of the points made by Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which talks about ODA, which talks about official development assistance that should be also used to increase capacities of national tax authorities to make sure that we are able to both tax and capture economic potential and not only rely upon transfer from developed economies, but also to rely upon local potential, because that's where the huge opportunities also lie. And this brings us to the previous question, getting prices right. Because one of the reasons why we have great economies probably also because taxation is unbearable. Or people don't see value in paying taxes because public services are not really good, or they are really bad in some aspects. So these are huge challenges. On another question related to the synergy needed between international organizations, probably consultancies, other private companies, in order to make sure that capacities are properly developed in countries. I fully agree with what you said, and I also see it in my region. We see lack of administrative capacities at both government level, but even a bigger issue at local level. And most of the services people care from come from the local level. That's where you go to those counters, you go every day and try to resolve some of the needs you have. And that's where I think a lot of efforts should be concentrated on. To some extent, countries from the Western Balkans or Eastern European countries have been in to some extent, easier situation. And right now, they're to some extent an easier situation because along with SDG, Agenda 2030, all of our countries are part of the European integration process. And the European agenda is already very comprehensive. But and what I like about some of the reports, I know in Montenegro they've done a great job in trying to identify the shortcomings of the European agenda related to SDGs, is that you still identify the different gaps that can be filled by focusing on SDG goals. But I'm saying this because there's a lot of technical assistance coming from European integration process, focused on building administrative capacities. But after a while, after a lot of trainings and so on and so on, you see all of a sudden people leave. Those trained, skilled people, they leave, they move to the private sector. Yes, private sector or private consultancies, yes, we are all sinful to some extent because we offer better terms, and then people realize that for their personal lives, it is a good opportunity at some point to move. But instead of looking at it as a big problem, I think we need to try to employ more constructive approach in making sure that those consultancies and those skillful people who have moved remain in a way in a public service. And that is also one of the ways how I read public-private partnerships. Sometimes governments or ministries, local officials, they cannot sort out every problem, and they are expected to do a lot. But building synergies between those companies on a long-term basis might be one of the solutions to circumvent this continued issue of being underpaid, working a lot, long hours, without proper satisfaction, which we come across in many countries of Southeast Europe or Central Asia.
If I could ask you to please start wrapping up. I hate to interrupt the flow and the first panel, but it's time for coffee.
Yes, please. So, for brevity's sake, I will just answer the first question, which I think is very, very important. And I think I mentioned paying taxes as part of governance agenda. Why? Not just because governments need money to fund education, healthcare, or infrastructure. Governments also need to collect taxes to show that everybody is in the same boat. You see that the system is fair, that the elites are not benefiting at the expense of the rest of the public. And we see that in our countries, where we ask people, do you think that success in your country is due to talent, skill, or effort, or breaking the law, corruption, connections, and so on? And you see that if people believe that the system is not fair, even if they themselves are doing well, even if they themselves have benefited from transition, they reject market reforms. For them, the feeling of fairness is huge. And we also see in our new countries of operations, which are still thinking about reforms going forward, if they see that middle class doesn't pay taxes, blue-collar workers are not happy with the reform packages. They say, we all need to be in the same boat. We all need to make sure that we are paying taxes. And in that sense, we commit, and as a bank, we actually subscribe to EU domiciliation policies. We take the conditionality of either EU domiciliation policy or Global Forum's recommendation, whichever is stricter in our projects, because we think that we ourselves as an international organization should also set the standard, should also follow the strict standards in being transparent, accountable, and so on. And our partners in our own projects have to comply as well, which of course sometimes costs us projects. We cannot do some projects which otherwise would be great projects, but they are not, as you rightly said, accountable from the transparency taxation point of view. But I should say that there is a lot of attention paid to this in the international community. All these schemes that Igor mentioned, what's called Irish-Dutch sandwich, base erosion and profit shifting schemes, they all are being closed down. There are many initiatives which are now happening exactly this year through automated exchange of information between tax agencies. So I think there'll be movement in that direction, exactly because countries wake up to this problem that if top companies and top individuals, top 1%, top 10%, avoid paying taxes, that you cannot push this agenda forward, because the public says, your reforms, your growth models, your development conversations are benefiting top 10%, top 1%. This is not for all of us. And in that sense, paying taxes is a huge part of the social contract. Without fair governance systems, which involves fair tax payment, we are not going to succeed.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you both of you for bringing very different perspectives to our questions, and the conclusion that I think the idea of the social contract is still very much alive, and we just need to apply it to today's world and make it work for each individual economy. But social contract means that everybody in society has to be part of the contract. And the SDGs will give us a long-term guide that will hopefully make it understandable to all actors that this is the only way for having a sustainable society and environment. So again, thank you so much, and with this I will close the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time for coffee, and I ask you to be please back promptly at 11:05. See you shortly. Bye-bye. That was excellent. There were more questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
hey, hey. Hey, 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 hey.